In a recent video, I described the priest king Melchizedek as the most mysterious man in the Bible, but there's a close runner-up, Nimrod. Nimrod is an ancient king mentioned only in passing in a brief interlude in the book of Genesis, describing him as the first on earth to become a mighty warrior. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. The text goes on to describe him as a founder of powerful cities. That's not a lot to go on. This short reference might hint at a much larger story that the biblical author may have assumed his readers already knew about, like some sort of Epic of Gilgamesh, but the biblical reference doesn't record any actual exploits or adventures. And as we've seen with obscure characters like Melchizedek and Enoch, later Christian and Jewish writers could not resist filling in the gaps. Like fanfiction writers, they turned Nimrod into all kinds of figures. A giant descended from the mysterious Nephilim, the mastermind behind the Tower of Babel, or even a tyrant who tried to kill Abraham in a fiery furnace. We'll dig into those legends later, but first let's tackle the version of Nimrod we get in Genesis. Unfortunately, archaeology doesn't help us that much. Despite the long lists of kings from the Sumerians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, a king named Nimrod never shows up. So scholars are left with questions. Was Nimrod a legendary hero, a garbled memory of a real king, or just a political allegory? To understand where Nimrod fits in the Bible, we first need to zoom out for a moment and look at the surrounding stories. The early chapters of Genesis, like the creation story, Adam and Eve, and Noah's flood, share many parallels with other ancient Near Eastern literature, like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Epic of Atrahasis. And these chapters function somewhat like a self-contained mythological cycle, only loosely connected with the rest of Genesis. But after the flood, the biblical narrative begins to shift gears. Genesis chapters 10 and 11 act as a kind of bridge, moving the story from a mythic past into a fully populated world of well-established nations. Genesis chapter 10 kicks off this transition with a simple line. These are the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. What follows is a long genealogy, often called the Table of Nations. It maps how the world is repopulated after the flood by tracing the descendants of Noah's 3 sons. According to the biblical scholar 𝗡𝗺𝗶𝗴, this is not just a list of names, it's a mythological map of the known world, an attempt to narrate the diversity of nations, peoples, and languages by linking them all back to one family. This method of storytelling is not unique to the Bible. The ancient Greeks did something similar. In a poem known as the Catalogue of Women, the Greek poet Hesiod traced the ancestry of the Greek people through genealogies of heroes. For example, he wrote that the man Deucalion, the Greek equivalent of Noah, had a daughter named Thea, who bore 2 sons, Magnus and Macedon. These sons became the legendary ancestors of the people of Magnesia and Macedonia. Hesiod also included figures like Arabus, the supposed ancestor of the Arabs. Now, of course, these stories are not historical in the modern sense, but they helped ancient readers understand where they came from, and how their neighbors fit into a shared mythic family tree. Genesis chapter 10 plays a similar role in the Hebrew Bible. So returning to Genesis, the actual story of Nimrod is just 4 verses long, tucked into the genealogy of a man named Cush, the Hebrew name for the ancient land of Nubia, just south of Egypt. It says Cush became the father of Nimrod. He was the first on earth to become a mighty warrior. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Resen between Nineveh and Calah. Now, on the surface, this sounds like a straightforward description of a king who starts his kingdom in southern Mesopotamia, around cities like Babylon and Uruk, and then expands northward into Assyria. In theory, this list of cities should help us pin down who Nimrod was, right? If one historical king had ruled over all these places, we could probably identify him. But the problem is, the cities mentioned here don't all belong to the same time period. Some of these sites, like Uruk and Nineveh, are among the oldest cities in all of Mesopotamia, dating back to the 3rd millennium BCE. Others, like Calah, only rose to prominence much later. Calah was a relatively minor town until Ashurnasirpal II made it the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 9th century BCE. We don't exactly know where the city of Resen was, but some scholars propose the site Dur-Sharrukin, which was founded even later by Sargon II in the late 700s. In other words, no single king could have founded all of these cities because they didn't all exist at the same time. This chronological spread makes it almost impossible to identify Nimrod with a real historical ruler. But the timing of the composition of this text gives us some clues. Many scholars believe that parts of Genesis, including this passage, were shaped during or after the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE, and ruled over the southern kingdom of Judah as a vassal for about a century. When Assyria collapsed in 609, the Babylonians took over, and just a few decades later, they destroyed Jerusalem and ended the kingdom of Judah. This was a formative moment in the development of Israelite traditions, and it's not hard to imagine that older Mesopotamian legends entered Judean storytelling during this time, passed down through the Assyrians. And this portrayal of Nimrod as the founder of both very ancient cities and more recent Neo-Assyrian cities might reflect the political world of that time. The mix of cities from very different periods suggests that the figure of Nimrod was not drawn from one historical memory. By taking a less literal approach to the text, scholars have come up with a few theories about the identity of Nimrod. First, Sargon of Akkad. One puzzling detail in the Nimrod story is his genealogy. He's listed as the son of Cush, but Cush is the Hebrew name for ancient Nubia, an African kingdom south of Egypt. In the biblical Table of Nations, Cush is a descendant of Ham, while Mesopotamian nations are usually traced through Shem. So Nimrod's placement here is odd. It's also geographically confusing, since Nubia and Mesopotamia are nowhere near each other. To explain this mismatch, the scholar Yigal Levine published a paper in 2002, proposing that the biblical author may have confused Cush with Kish, a well-known city near Babylon in ancient Mesopotamia. Kish was the city where kingship itself descended from heaven after the flood, and one of the most famous kings in ancient Mesopotamian legend, Sargon of Akkad, first ruled Kish before founding the Akkadian Empire, stretching from Babylonia up to Assyria. And even after moving his capital to the city of Akkad, Sargon kept the prestigious title, King of Kish. The Neo-Assyrian kings later revived this title, because the cuneiform character used to write the name Kish could also mean totality or entirety in the Akkadian language. So to be the king of Kish was to be the king of the world. The parallels between Nimrod and Sargon are hard to ignore. Both are remembered as the first great king. Both begin their reigns in Babylonia and extend their power up to Assyria, and both may be linked to the city of Kish, where kingship itself originated. And just as Genesis calls Nimrod a mighty hunter, Neo-Assyrian kings love to depict themselves hunting lions as symbols of divine power and control over nature. For example, the palace of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh is famous for its dramatic lion hunt reliefs. Sargon of Akkad and his grandson Naram-Sin both enjoyed long reigns, and their legends remained well known for millennia to come, almost like Mesopotamia's version of King Arthur. So Levine concludes that Nimrod is a literary echo of Sargon and maybe his grandson, a version filtered through a Neo-Assyrian lens updated for a new audience. Now, another theory takes a different angle entirely. Instead of looking for a historical king behind Nimrod, some scholars suggest that he may originally have been a Mesopotamian god who was later historicized as a human ruler. And if that's the case, then the confusing time gaps between the cities linked to Nimrod are not a problem at all. Gods, after all, don't follow human timescales. The leading candidate here is Ninurta, a Sumerian god of agriculture, hunting, and war. The worship of Ninurta remained influential for centuries, and his popularity surged again in the Neo-Assyrian period. Several Assyrian kings even incorporated Ninurta into their throne names. An important temple was also built to him in Kalhu, one of the cities listed in the Nimrod passage. The scholar Ron Hendel has recently argued that the name Nimrod could derive from Ninurta with a few plausible phonetic shifts, Nin to Nim and Urt to Rud. On this basis, Hendel suggests that Nimrod is a euhemerized version of Ninurta, meaning a god transformed into a legendary human. From the Israelite perspective, this figure becomes not just a mythic king, but a stand-in for the entire Assyrian Empire. To support his argument, Hendel points to another passage from the Hebrew Bible, Micah chapter 5, verse 5, which refers to Assyria as the land of Nimrod. Hendel writes, Ninurta was the son of the god Ashur and the protector of the king in Assyrian royal ideology. Ninurta and the Assyrian king were counterparts. In these respects, it is understandable that Nimrod, the Hebrew reflection of Ninurta, is the hero founder of Mesopotamian kingship and a mighty warrior and hunter. Other scholars agree, describing the Nimrod passage as the vestiges of Mesopotamian mythological motifs purposefully reworked to make them more acceptable for an Israelite believer. Many scholars have pointed out that the name Nimrod contains the root word meaning to rebel in Hebrew, and Nimrod itself can be interpreted to mean we will rebel. Now, we don't know if this is coincidental or integral to the character of Nimrod, but Hendel speculates that it reflects the desire of the Israelites to rebel against Neo-Assyrian domination. One additional detail might support the Ninurta theory. In 2 Kings chapter 19, the Assyrian king Sennacherib is said to have been assassinated in the temple of his god Nisroch, but there's no known Assyrian god by that name. Hendel speculates that a scribal error might be at play. If you replace the Hebrew letters Samek and Kaf with the similar-looking Mem and Dalet, Nisroch becomes Nimrod. And in theory, this passage might have originally referred to Nimrod as the god of Sennacherib before the text was corrupted to Nisroch, and it would support the idea that Nimrod was the Hebrew name for Ninurta. Still, this part of the theory is more speculative. Ninurta's influence had faded by Sennacherib's time, and he was more closely linked with the god Ashur. Plus, Sennacherib was likely killed in Nineveh, not Kalhu, where Ninurta's temple stood. So while the Nisroch to Nimrod idea is intriguing, it remains unproven. As things stand, these two theories seem to be our best options for identifying the Nimrod of Genesis chapter 10. The Sargon of Akkad theory fits better with Nimrod's depiction as the first great king of history, and the Ninurta theory fits better with his name and various Assyrian connections. After the Bible, the figure of Nimrod took on a second life in Jewish and Christian imagination. Later interpreters reinvented his legacy, sometimes in surprising ways. Some of these new traditions cast him as a positive character. For example, the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, an ancient Aramaic translation and elaboration of Genesis, adds a new twist to Genesis chapter 10. It says that Nimrod didn't want to be part of the so-called generation of divisions, so God moved him out of Shinar and resettled him in Assyria. That phrase, generation of divisions, refers to a mysterious line in Genesis 10:25, which says that in the days of Peleg, the grandson of Shem, the earth was divided. Many ancient interpreters connected this verse to the story of the Tower of Babel in the next chapter, where God scatters humanity across the earth to disrupt their attempt to build a city and a tower. So in the Targum's version, Nimrod opposes the Tower of Babel, and as a result, God rewards him by granting him new territory in Assyria. We see a similar interpretation in Christian sources. The 4th century theologian Ephraim the Syrian praises Nimrod as a kind of divine agent. He writes, Nimrod was a strong giant before the Lord, because in accordance with God's will, he waged war upon the peoples in order to spread them out to the areas that God had allotted them. Therefore, if someone wants to bless a leader or king, he says, may you become like Nimrod, a strong giant before the Lord, triumphant in the wars of the Lord. Basically, Nimrod's fame came from the fact that he had battled the builders of the Tower of Babel, driving them away from the city in accordance with God's will. These positive portrayals, though relatively rare today, likely reflect a much larger body of early Jewish literature that has since been lost. The few surviving examples might just be fragments of a more widespread tradition in which Nimrod was remembered as a righteous warrior doing God's will. But while a few traditions paint Nimrod as a righteous figure, the more widespread interpretation turned him into a villain. One of the earliest examples of this comes from Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher writing in the early 1st century CE. Philo was known for his more allegorical approach to scripture, and in his questions and answers on Genesis, he offers a symbolic reading of Nimrod's genealogy. He interprets Cush, Nimrod's father, as a symbol of spiritual barrenness, someone cut off from heavenly things. This, in turn, casts Nimrod not as an ordinary human, but as a kind of giant who stands in opposition to God. Now, Philo is pulling together several ideas circulating in Second Temple Judaism. One of them is the connection between giants and spiritual rebellion. Genesis chapter 6 briefly mentions that the so-called sons of God took human wives and produced children called the ɡibarim, a term meaning mighty ones or heroes, which is the same word used to describe Nimrod in Genesis 10. But when Genesis was translated into Greek, they chose to translate ɡibarim as gigantes, from which we get the word giants. In Greek mythology, the giants were semi-divine beings born from the earth, powerful and dangerous. Over time, this translation led to a new interpretation, that the ɡibarim were literal giants. Jews of the Hellenistic period were fascinated by the possibility that ancient giants had survived Noah's flood and had interacted with various biblical people and places. And for Philo, Nimrod was undoubtedly one of these giants, though it's not clear whether Philo literally believed this, since he treats it as another allegory. Philo also draws on another interpretive shift. The Hebrew phrase in Genesis 10 says Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord, using a Hebrew word which usually means in the sight of, or as witnessed by. But the Greek translation renders it using the word enantion, which can mean against or in opposition to. And since Philo was familiar with the Greek translation of Genesis, this one translation choice launched a centuries-long tradition of portraying Nimrod as an opponent or adversary of God. This tradition gained momentum in the late 1st century CE when the Jewish historian Josephus puts his own spin on the Nimrod legend, saying that Nimrod was an insolent king of Babylon who convinced everyone that God was trying to disperse them so that they would be open to attack. Nimrod then began constructing a tower with the intention of making it so high that they could survive a second flood. Josephus writes, he threatened to have his revenge on God if he wished to inundate the earth again, for he would build a tower higher than the water could reach and avenge the destruction of their forefathers. But later stories took Nimrod's villain arc in even stranger directions. In a late 1st century text called the Book of Biblical Antiquities, which is falsely attributed to Philo, we see a similar story that we just saw in Josephus. Nimrod is cast as the tyrant king of Babylon who builds the Tower of Babel, but then he tries to punish Abraham for refusing to help by throwing him into a fiery furnace. God saves him though. God stirred up a great earthquake, and the fire gushed forth of the furnace, and broke out into flames and sparks of fire, and consumed all them that stood round in the sight of the furnace. And Abraham rose out of the furnace, and the fiery furnace fell down, and Abraham was saved. If this sounds familiar, it should. It clearly rips off the Book of Daniel, where 3 Judeans are thrown into a furnace by King Nebuchadnezzar and walk out unharmed. Scholars believe that this Abraham story likely grew out of a pun on Genesis 15:7, where God says he brought Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldeans. In Hebrew, Ur can also mean fire, and that wordplay sparked centuries of speculation about Abraham surviving the fire of the Chaldeans. For example, in the rabbinic commentary called Genesis Rabbah, Nimrod becomes kind of a theological foil to Abraham. In a dramatic debate, Nimrod insists that fire is the most powerful force in the universe. He says, "Let us worship the fire." Abraham replies, "Should we not then worship the water which extinguishes the fire?" Nimrod replies, "Then let us worship the water." And the conversation continues, saying we should worship clouds, wind, and then finally humanity. Eventually, Nimrod grows frustrated and says, "You are merely piling words. We should bow to none other than the fire. I shall therefore cast you in it, and let your God to whom you bow come and save you from it." This fiery showdown and fire-worshipping theme had staying power in later Christian and Jewish texts. A late antique Christian text called Pseudo-Clemens Recognitions says that Nimrod went to Persia and taught the Persians to worship fire. And this is where the legend starts to brush up against another famous fire survivor, Zoroaster. Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, is the founder of Zoroastrianism, a religion commonly stereotyped by outsiders for worshipping fire, even though this is a misconception. To call someone a fire worshipper in late antiquity was basically a polemical shorthand for Zoroastrian. So when ancient texts describe Nimrod as a fire worshipper, they might be subtly, or not so subtly, hinting that he was Zoroaster, or at least a rival imitation. One Christian text makes this explicit, calling Nimrod a giant who chose to think thoughts in opposition to God. It is he whom the Greeks knew as Zoroaster. In this retelling, Nimrod inherits magical powers and becomes a sorcerer, which is also linked to Greco-Roman stereotypes about Zoroaster. According to Pliny the Elder, Zoroaster himself invented magic. The story goes on to say that Nimrod tries to seize a king's throne using sorcery, but the reigning king calls down heavenly fire to punish him. So when Nimrod the Magus had been slain by the lightning that had fallen from heaven, his name was changed to Zoroaster, since the stream of living fire from the star had descended upon him. Aster is the ancient Greek word for a star, so the author here is using this etymology to explain the mythical transformation. Nimrod is renamed Zoroaster because divine starfire descended upon him. Now, not all versions are this explicit, but even when Zoroaster is not explicitly named, the connection between Zoroastrianism and Nimrod seems to linger for centuries. Rabbinical Jewish depictions of Nimrod as a fire worshipper and persecutor of Abraham may be a polemical move. In one Zoroastrian tale, Zoroaster is thrown into a fire by evil sorcerers and survives unscathed. But in the Jewish version, it's Abraham who walks out of the flames, and Nimrod who casts him into it. The scholar 𝗡𝗺𝗄𝗄 argues that by transforming Zoroaster into Nimrod, the villain, the rabbis reframe a competing religious founder as an arrogant tyrant who tried to kill Abraham, the true monotheist. It's theological one-upmanship through storytelling. So much like Melchizedek, Nimrod's story shows how the same person can be spun in totally different ways depending on who's telling the story. One moment he's God's mighty hunter, the next he's throwing Abraham into a furnace. That spin from hero to villain is something we face all the time when reading the news today. That's why I use Ground News, the sponsor of today's video. Ground News is a website and app on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, and objective way to read the news. They aggregate stories from a bunch of different media outlets and pair those stories with a visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the sources reporting. For example, check out this story about the Trump administration rescinding a nearly $38 million fine against Grand Canyon University, a for-profit Christian university. Back in 2023, the Department of Education under the Biden administration fined GCU, accusing it of misleading students about the true cost of its doctoral programs. Only about 2% of students actually paid the price that the school was advertising, but the Trump administration dismissed the case. When we look up the story on Ground News, we see about 20 outlets covering the story, but the coverage overwhelmingly leans right when we check out the biased distribution. The factuality rating shows that over half of these sources have mixed reliability, while only about a third are rated as highly factual. And the ownership breakdown reveals who's behind the headlines, whether it's independent outlets, wealthy individuals, or major media conglomerates. The headline comparison tool also shows how each outlet is framing the story. The right-wing outlet Breitbart frames it along partisan lines and highlights the religious affiliation of the school. Trump's Department of Education rescinds Biden's $37 million fine on Christian University, while the left-leaning Freedom from Religion Foundation highlights the original allegations. FFRF blasts administration for dropping fine against misleading Christian University. This story shows up in another great tool on Ground News, their blind spot feed, which highlights stories disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum or the other, which can help you break out of media bubbles you might be stuck in. If you'd like to give Ground News a try, Ground News is giving viewers 40% off their Vantage plan. Go to ground.news/religion for breakfast or click the link in the description below to get started, and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.